Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alexander Horwitz, and I'm the Executive Director of New Yorkers United for Justice, NYUJ. NYUJ is a bipartisan interfaith coalition of 14 local and national organizations, all of whom are deeply invested in delivering meaningful, common sense criminal justice reforms to New York State. We've invited you today to join us in discussing the next and most critical frontier in criminal justice reform, New York's parole system. In short, parole in New York is wasteful, ineffective, and exacerbates the racial and racist disparities that drive the mass incarceration of Black and brown people. It is expensive, it is broken, and it is biased. New York's system of parole fails returning citizens, reincarcerating New Yorkers at a blistering rate for non-criminal offenses, even during a pandemic. But it also fails the state as a whole. It costs New York taxpayers hundreds of millions of dollars with no good evidence of improving public safety. Finally, New York's parole system unfairly targets Black and brown people both on the front end, where white New Yorkers are more likely to be paroled in the first place, and in the revocation process, where Black and brown New Yorkers are more likely to be sanctioned with punishments that destroy families, cause the loss of work and housing, and undermine our fundamental values of justice and liberty. The time for reform is now. That's why NYUJ has recently launched a public campaign to build the legislative momentum we need to permanently change this system and make our state safer and fairer for all. It's also why today's discussion could not be more urgent. Following today's roundtable, we invite you to explore our resources and publications on the state of parole in New York by visiting our website at nyuj.org. If you have questions for our panelists today, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen at any time during the discussion. With that, I'd like to introduce you to your moderator for today. She is the founder and executive director of the Ladies of Hope Ministries and a senior advisor to the NYUJ Coalition. She is a nationally and internationally recognized advocate for all those impacted by the criminal legal system, especially women and children. And in recognition of her enormous contributions to this movement, she recently received a presidential pardon. Please welcome Topeka K. Sam.
Thank you so much, Alexander, for that very generous introduction. It is a great honor to be able to be a senior advisor with New Yorkers United for Justice, but also to be able to moderate today's panel. We have some of the top powerhouses in New York and beyond who are going to share their expertise with you all today on why we need to change New York State's parole system and why now it is so timely. As a previously incarcerated New Yorker myself, having gone through the federal system and also dealing with supervision, both probation and parole, if you will, understanding the disparities, as Alexander mentioned, of women, period, but also people of color, the impacts that this has on families, New York families are tremendous. They are just consistently disrupting our communities, our families, the entire construct of what really parole and support is supposed to be upon release of people who are incarcerated. And I don't want to take up too much time because I know my sister Amy, who was also previously incarcerated, will talk about the women and what that impact is to women and families, specifically that of New York. So I'm incredibly excited to introduce our panelists. First, I want to introduce Ames Grawert, who is the Senior Counsel for Brennan Center for Justice, District Attorney Eric Gonzalez, Brooklyn DA's Attorney's Office. We have Tina Luongo, who is the Attorney in Charge, Criminal Defense Practice, Legal Aid Society. Again, Amy Jones, my sister, formerly incarcerated individual and community organizer here in New York, and the Jerika Richardson, Senior Vice President, Equitable Justice and Strategic Initiatives, National Urban League. Welcome, everyone. Again, super excited. This is going to be a great conversation, so I'm just going to get right to all of the questions. And first, I'm going to start with DA Eric Gonzalez. From a law enforcement's perspective, why is New York State's current approach to parole harmful to communities and public safety? And also, what other policies regarding parole would you like to see implemented beyond New York City throughout the state?
Hi, Topeka. Thank you for moderating this panel, and I want to thank New Yorkers United for Justice for hosting this important discussion as it relates to our parole system. I'm Brooklyn DA Eric Gonzalez. It's important for me to talk very specifically about my obligations as the Chief Law Enforcement Officer in Brooklyn. You know, it's an obligation to keep the people of Brooklyn safe and to promote trust in our justice system. And quite frankly, after looking at our parole system, looking at what its intended purpose is to do, which is to help readjust and help with reentry for people who've spent time in prison, to safely reintegrate and be successful in our communities, and to provide safety. And also my obligation to really promote fairness and justice in our criminal legal system. I don't think that parole is doing either. It's not effectively keeping us safe, and it's not promoting fairness or justice. We see that people are tethered to the criminal justice system, that people are excessively on parole for periods of time that they no longer need to be on parole, and that connection to the criminal justice system sort of yo-yos them in and out of the system. So we see in New York State where people are being violated for technical violations. I'm sure we'll talk more about that, but a large percentage of the cases that we see in our office are people who come into the system not because they committed a new crime, but because they've been violated for non-compliance of some conditions. And some of those conditions really should not equate to reincarceration. If we think and we care about public safety, if we want people to be successful as they reenter into our communities, we can't continue to separate them from the communities that love and support them, from employment, from families. And so I think these policies have to be re-examined. There are over 35,000 people on parole and supervision in New York State. And we just don't need that many people to be on parole. And if you can't effectively supervise that many people, that type of supervision really should be for the most serious cases. So, we look at it in our office. I believe that my obligation to do justice really extends way past the entering of a guilty plea by a person or by a conviction after a trial, that we have to continue to pursue justice and fairness and all of the other issues that we, and values in our system, which include accountability, rehabilitation. And so we're looking at whether or not people who are in prison deserve to come out, and when they're out, that they're treated equitably. And we see the racial disparities in all of these parole decisions. So to be very clear, we created a post-conviction justice bureau here in Brooklyn. I believe it's the first of its kind in the nation. It's clearly the first of its kind in New York State. The conviction review unit is part of that. We also very specifically have a parole and clemency unit. We've supported parole since the unit was created in 2019. We've supported parole in over 130 cases. We've done visits to prisons. We've worked with reentry. And we've supported clemency and commutations with the governor's office, and we're supporting the Less is More Act on parole. And coming from someone who's involved in public safety and responsible for it, I believe that we will be safer if we use our supervision powers in more effective and more fair ways. And so that's it. And what I'd like us to do is really sort of re-examine how we're doing this work. And I would love the legislature to really pass less is more. I'm a true believer that the parts of that legislation is fair. It will reduce and restrict our use of incarceration for many technical violations. And when incarceration may be needed, it's graduated sanctions. It will also, I think very importantly, provide due process. And one of the largest problems that I currently have with our parole system is that there's very little due process afforded to people on parole, and during their violations, it takes time to get speedy hearings. So with all that also prevents the district attorney's office from resolving cases, because often, and Tina will tell you, it's often hard to resolve cases while there's a pending parole matter. So there's a lot of times I'd like to divert a case. I'd like to put someone in some kind of program or some kind of services, and we can't even do that. We can't enter this plea. We can't get this moving because we think that just the entering of the plea or putting someone into services may cause them to be violated because they really don't have appropriate representation in the parole setting. So for all those reasons, I think that we will be safer if we actually are very smart with how we treat parole.
Thank you so much, DA Gonzalez. One of the points that you made that was just so eloquently put is that when people are leaving prison, we want to make sure that, the way we have safer communities is providing them the resources and opportunities that they need during reentry. But also the fact is that, we don't need these systems to continue to be punitive for no reason. And, when we're looking at technical violations, and Amy, as someone who is formerly incarcerated, and you've had direct experience with parole, can you describe your experience with the parole system and maybe share some of the technical violations that either yourself and or other people that you work with have experienced so people understand what that means?
Sure, absolutely. So my post-release supervision was actually federal. And I was very young. My initial charge, I was very young. And so when I was on community supervision federally, it felt impossible to me. And I really didn't understand the parameters of it. And I had my very first experience with the criminal justice system was federal, and I went to prison behind it. So I didn't have a long history. So I really didn't have a lot of experience with the post-release system. So my experience came as I began to work in an alternative to incarceration, community-based situation as a direct service person. I had an office within our Albany, the New York State Parole Community Supervision, the Albany office. And that's really where my experience with New York State Parole comes from as a direct service professional. My last justice involved incident was probably like in 2007, and it started in like 1990, oh my goodness, the early 90s. And so I spent a good chunk of that time in and out of periods of incarceration. When I was completely came home, my reentry process took about 3 years to really get traction in my life and to really get the help that I needed and the services that I needed. And they were completely holistic, from family unification to help navigating my post-release supervision to food, clothes, housing, all of those things. And I ended up working, as a direct service professional, case managing, outreach, things of that nature, until I got what is called an OWDS, which is an Offender Workforce Development Specialist credential through the Office of Probation and Correctional Alternatives. And that's when my professional life as a direct service person really expanded. And I started doing Ready, Set, Work in New York State, which is this huge deliverable in grant programs and things of that nature. But what I saw at Parole was that we are light years away from law enforcement and Black and Brown communities having any sort of a trust relationship. It is completely punitive, and a lot of times it is, almost all of the time, it is just anti-Black. And I remember, out of all of the things that I've experienced working, at Parole with parole officers, finding out who my allies were, because my first alignment was always going to be with the person on parole, because that was my life experience informed my work, right? So, but I remember a parole officer, a very abusive one, bringing her two pit bulls to work and letting them loose in my office. And dogs are a huge part historically of the harm caused by law enforcement in Black and Brown communities. And she let the dogs go in my office and laughed, and, you know, and I just thought that was hugely, hugely violent. And then it just led me to understand more of the, you know, the person that that parole officer was, um, and more of what I was up against from like a micro or macro aggressive way into a system that hugely represents that. So I just think we have a long, long way to go to where policy actually reaches the ground, where policy actually begins to affect justice-involved individuals. And I'll do this last piece and then I'll stop. I did a lot of organizing and advocacy work around the decarceral pretrial reforms that were introduced and passed last year. And it was my DA here in Albany County that was the president of DASNY that led the charge against rolling them back. And so, you know, we fought a really good fight, and it became heartbreaking when they were rolled back during the budget. But I mean, to really immerse yourself in Topeka, I know that you know more than anyone else, to really become an advocate, you have to, like, from the policy and the legislation to like reaching the ground, people like us who have been justice involved literally have to educate ourselves from that arena to, you know, to the legislative arena. And so I'm really glad to be here. I'm really glad to be involved in this conversation. And I really need like law enforcement to understand that there are advocates like us here who are wholly invested in creating equity for justice-involved individuals, especially in Black and Brown communities.
Thank you so much, Amy, for sharing your personal experience. And, you know, I just want to set a tone that whether or not you've been supervised under the federal system or state parole, these systems are the same, and they are actually were to be designed to help re-enter people in the community, give them connections and access to resources that's helping them and their families and communities to be able to be transformed. Unfortunately, as the founding executive director of the Ladies of Hope Ministries and Hope House, you know, we actually have women who are both under federal supervision and state parole that come to our program. And so often there have been so many issues, you know, just to share a few of their issues, being able to access safe and affordable housing or just safe housing. Often they probation officers or parole officers, excuse me, would rather have women in shelters where violence, sexual violence and trauma are perpetuated, where they are actually open to being vulnerable and sex or human trafficked, and all of these things, opposed to allowing them in a house where there are other women who have experienced the same things to help to heal them, right? Or, you know, the fact of, I remember myself where I had to get permission every time I wanted to leave the Bronx to go to Brooklyn. And that's just a train ride across the bridge. And, you know, how exhausting that may be. I mean, amongst all of the other things, I was told I couldn't vote, although I could. And, you know, people aren't being informed appropriately. But then, you know, having difficulty being able to reunify again and connect our families, make sure that women are having opportunities getting their children back, having access to true resources that are going to help to implement these new opportunities, opposed to having women and families consistently separated, and then the cycle and perpetuation of incarceration and further state violence among our community. So I agree, but whether or not, again, these systems of over-incarceration and post-incarceration are happening, and to your point initially, that New York is far behind some of the other things that are being proposed across the country. And I'm so happy to have you, you know, join our conversation in the needs that need to happen here in New York. So thank you for that. And Tina, just to move a little forward, while overall prison and jail populations have gone down in recent years, studies have shown that parole denials and technical revocations are increasingly driving incarceration rates in New York. How does the parole system perpetuate over incarceration?
Thank you very much. And this is a really critical conversation. And I'm really happy to hear that we're centering on services and reentry. Because if you think about first and foremost what drives somebody into a criminal justice system, right? At the point, we are this legal aid societies where we're the citywide provider of public defense. We also are the group that's at Rikers Island when those hearings are happening there for parole revocation, and we have an appeals unit. And so we see this cycle, right? It's a vicious cycle that starts with the lack of resources and investment in communities that brings somebody to have a charge, to be prosecuted. And while, yes, we've done really great reforms in pretrial space and reducing the number of people being churned out into the criminal justice system, we still do have people going to upstate to serve prison sentences and then returned home. And you know what the number one factor is in terms of somebody coming back on a revocation? It's that lack of service, the same thing that drove the person into the criminal justice system in the first place. So in order to break that cycle, we have got to have change. And while advocates such as yourself and Ms. Jones and others have been calling for it for decades, we've seen sort of a failure actually in our systems do it right. And so you talk about technical parole violations. Here's what we're talking about: a dirty urine, not reporting the right address, missing a curfew. Those are the things we are reincarcerating people on. And the reality of that situation is that a person who's reincarcerated, and the number of those people are going up at Rikers Island when numbers of pretrial people have gone down, although the rollbacks are not helping that. That's a different conversation for a different day. But certainly what we see is that those people are remanded. They don't have a chance to bail out. Eric is right. If we try to get people placed back into community, there are obstacles created by docs in order to have those things happen fast. But you also have people who are languishing right now in prison, being sort of ready to come home, wanting to come home, having loving families to return to and communities. What's stopping that? We're not doing clemency right. Governor could release people right now. Over 5,000 people have tested positive. There is a release mechanism right now to bring those people safely home. That's not happening. So what do we need to do? We need law reform. There are about 11,000 people, about 20% of the people who are incarcerated right now in prisons are over 50. Science shows that folks who are released, they come home and they live their lives. They want to grow old with their families. They want to meet with their friends and play dominoes in communities, right? They want to give back because they miss their family. And yet they are languishing. The Board of Parole, the statistics is that they are roughly hearing about 60 hearings a day by video. The reality of that situation is they're turning away those people over and over and over. We have clients, we have a parole unit of lawyers and law school interns that help people build their parole packages. And what we see time and time again is the people go to the board and then get denied. And that's because they're focusing on not who the person is now, but that we have a board that focuses on a charge, something that might have happened in a moment in somebody's life that is now defining their release forever, as opposed to who they are now, how they've changed, how they've given back, how they're mentors now to other people who are incarcerated. The over-incarceration stems from these cycles, not recognizing that in order to do it differently, in order to come from a decarceral invest in a person, as opposed to a penal law, you've got to break the cycle. So the laws that are now ready to go can move right now. Less is more, right? The elder parole package that's ready, the halt solitary, which is about the humanity of when you decide to cage somebody, how you should treat them as a human. All of these things are ready to go. And they have to go. Because unfortunately, what we've seen, as you've all described, is that the system has the baked in racism, that is centuries long, that have not been able to recognize its own discrimination. And these laws, these reforms, they're there to break it, to interrupt the cycle, and to start building in humanity and giving back the lives that have been taken from these laws. So I'm hopeful, because I think that the reality of the situation is that advocates, impacted people, people who are home waiting for their loved ones, as well as people who are inside screaming for justice, that's the movement that needs to bring this change. And I've never seen a more unified force in my close to 20 years as a public defender in New York City, which makes me hopeful and fired up that we can do this, and we can do this right now.
Thank you so much, Tina. Just the way you laid out around the technical violations that perpetuate the over-incarceration of people in New York, the lack of clemency use by the governor, and how we can look immediately to release the over 5,000 people who are currently infected with COVID in New York State. And just, how, again, the racial or the racism that has happened for centuries, as pointed, that has driven incarceration here in New York State. And, I would tend to say that we recognize that. I think that, fear, and the fear that has been perpetuated over decades, centuries, as you said, is why people just cannot move. But in your hope, I'm hopeful as well. The fact that all of us on the call, from an attorney and the district attorney and people previously incarcerated and the Urban League, and that we do understand that it's going to take all of us through the work of NYUJ in order to make these changes. And with the parole legislation that has already been introduced and so many advocacy groups that have been doing this, I think right now we will get this done. And just very, very happy to see so many elected officials and things that decided to come on and listen to what the people are calling for, because now is definitely the time. And Jerika, in New York, the parole system is known, as we have heard, disproportionately impact communities of color. For example, a recent investigation by the Times Union showed that white parole applicants are actually more likely to be granted parole compared to Black and Brown parole applicants. How does the parole system impact Black and Brown communities and perpetuate the racial inequities that have been mentioned?
Thank you, Topeka. First and foremost, I want to thank Alexander Horowitz and all the staff and members of New Yorkers United for Justice for having me here today. And Topeka, I also want to thank you for sharing your experiences throughout this conversation and giving me the opportunity to provide some important context to this issue with that question. The structural racism baked into our parole system is well established. Black people in New York City are almost 7 times as likely as whites to be under parole supervision, and they are 12 times as likely to be detained for parole violations, and 5 times as likely to be incarcerated for a violation. And if you look across the state, Black and Latinx New Yorkers are placed under community supervision at a rate 8 and 2.5 times higher than that of white New Yorkers, respectively, and significantly higher than that of the national average. Look, the consequences of structural racism within the parole system extend far beyond the incarceration of any one individual. They wreak havoc on our families and our communities. Every restrictive condition of parole, every detention, and every incarceration is like a stone tossed into a pond with the ripples extending ever outward. Employment opportunities are lost. When we think about it, housing opportunities are lost. Opportunities to seek help for substance abuse and mental health issues are also lost. The New York State Bar Association found that incarcerating people for technical parole violations plays a decidedly negative role in terms of integrating these persons back into the community, and it's extremely costly in human and economic terms. In her seminal work, The New Jim Crow, legal scholar Michelle Alexander notes that 30 to 50% of people under parole supervision in San Francisco and Los Angeles were homeless. Now, think for a second and imagine the impact of parole policies on this coast. Probation officers in most states can require that an individual dedicate 35% of his or her income towards fees, fines, and surcharges. A parolee living below the poverty line can be required to surrender 100% of his or her earnings. The reality is, parole violations stem from disadvantage. A parolee who can't afford to pay their supervision fees or other court costs will stop reporting to supervision, leading to violation proceedings for failure to report. We must divest from probation, from parole, and incarceration. And we need to really start investing in access to jobs, housing, education, and voluntary community-based substance use disorder treatment and mental health services. In 2020, the New York State Legislature ushered in a myriad of reforms related to policing, transparency, and accountability. I can tell you firsthand, those reforms are being heralded and touted around the country. But sadly, when it comes to parole reform, New York is way behind many other states. It really is time to show leadership. New York must not squander this opportunity to reform the parole system and combat a major contributor to racial, economic, and social inequity. Quite frankly, the time for action on this issue is now. Thank you.
Well, it's not much that I'm going to say or add to that. That's why I said the Jerika L. Richardson when I introduced you. But you laid this out so perfectly just around the things that are happening. And it drove me to a thought around how Black and brown people are actually given even more lengthier sentences. And I saw a statement in the Q&A from someone, I don't have it in front of me, sorry, but I read it briefly, where they said they want federal supervision and now on state parole. And I thought about the many people who has done 16 years. And I think about the many people who have done 16, 20 years, 10 years, 5 years, and then come home and then they're sentenced to life parole. And as if, like, how is that actually helpful? Just the idea of having a system consistently perpetuated on the back of your neck is suffocating. Right. And, you know, thinking about whether or not you know that you're living a righteous life. I mean, it's even now when there's a police officer that may be putting their lights on behind me, I still get nervous and freeze. Or if I see someone walking or I see what's happening, you know, these are triggers and things that happen based on our own experiences. And, you know, I remember Amy saying about, you know, the reentry piece. It's like once you've been incarcerated and you're coming home, that reentry space, it's no real time frame, right? Like I have women who have been home 10 years, 12 years, and still need help finding affordable housing. So just thinking again about just the barriers that people face and some of the things that you pointed out, this is a lifelong journey that people who have had convictions or have been suffered some type of state violence are going to consistently go through. And to have a system that is just going to consistently be more punitive and not helpful is harmful to our community at large. And so Ames, the parole system, as we know, and we heard Jerika talk about the divestment and reinvestment, is extremely costly. Studies have shown that the parole system spends more than $600 million of taxpayers' dollars annually. What does the defective parole system cost us in dollars and cents?
Thank you so much for having me, and I'm delighted to talk about this issue. I just want to underscore the point you just made. I think it's a really important one that we should circle back to later, to just the enormous barriers that people face, even if you don't factor in issues around parole, and then you add parole on top of it, and it just becomes that much more insurmountable. So I want to break down a couple different ways that our parole system and flaws with it cost the state money, cost state communities money, and can lead to increased poverty. But first of all, I want us to remember first and foremost that fixing parole is a moral and a racial justice issue. We've just heard some incredibly poignant testimony about how the parole system works, how it fails New Yorkers, how it interferes with people's lives. I just want to center that. The economics really matter. And the economics really matter to legislators balancing a difficult financial system in the state too. But I want to make sure we center the effect on real people. So first of all, some of the cost of this system to our state. As Topeka said, the state spends approximately $600 million every year reincarcerating people in connection with technical violations of parole. These are people who are on parole supervision, have not committed a new crime, and in some cases are merely suspected of having broken some condition of their parole. But it's way too easy to get people reincarcerated way too early in the process of adjudicating a technical violation. And that means spiraling costs or spiraling corrections costs related to jailing or holding these people in jail and then sending them back to prison if the violation is ultimately sustained. That's not money that's being effectively spent. It interrupts the reentry process, as I'm going to come back to later. And it quite simply imposes an upfront cost on state taxpayers too. When we've talked a little bit about unnecessary denials of parole too. Those two are not free exercises. There's really solid data showing that it costs New York State approximately $20,000 a year to hold someone in prison. Meanwhile, parole supervision costs around $2,000 a year. Depending on how you adjust for inflation, it's around those figures. But that means that every denial of parole that's a mistake, because you can come up for parole anytime within the next 2 years, can cost the state in the ballpark of another $40,000. That's a considerable cost to the state, and it's another 2 years of someone's life behind bars. So when we're talking about parole, we need to make sure that we're giving parole officers the tools to make informed, thoughtful, careful decisions. And it's not clear to me, as I hope we'll talk about later, that is actually the process as it happens now. So that's a real cost, and that can add up over a series of years as well. I want to return to the topic of economic justice as well, because our parole system has real costs for communities, and especially communities of color around the state too. So some research that my colleagues and I at the Brennan Center conducted over the past couple of years showed that time in prison can reduce someone's earning potential by around half compared to similarly situated people. These are disproportionately people who are already struggling with poverty, already struggling with economic disadvantage, and the time they've spent in prison becomes a stigma and a burden that they carry for the rest of their lives. And it becomes one more factor that makes it that much harder for people to escape poverty. The research that we conducted shows that time in prison and even a conviction record at times can mean the difference between escapable and inescapable poverty. And that's really, the report was sobering for a number of reasons, but I think it's really important to bear those in mind. So what does that mean for parole? So we speculate that one reason that prison has such a profound impact on people's ability to earn a living wage and to stand up on their own feet is that they don't have some of the support structures that we've talked about, how people need to return to their communities. And from everything we're hearing, especially about technical parole violations, a parole system that's not centered on rehabilitation, that's not centered on helping people, but can interfere with that process and make it that much harder to find a job, find a place to live. If you have to ask for authorization every time you cross from one borough to another, how much harder is it to find and maintain a job in an interconnected city? How much harder is it to build up economic and social capital so you can relaunch your career and take care of your family, take care of your kids, et cetera. Those are real serious costs too. So I think as we confront some of the pieces of our criminal justice system that sort of build this connection between poverty and incarceration, parole really has to be one of those factors, especially to the extent that it interferes with reentry. There's another aspect I want to talk to just quickly. I want to make sure we move on to hear some audience questions too. We actually know that poverty is, aside from a grinding, horrible human experience, it actually has its own collateral costs for the state as well. There's some solid research showing that poverty costs the United States $1.6 trillion over in increased social costs over years and years and years. If we can do anything to break the link between mass incarceration and poverty, we need to be doing that, not just as a moral and racial justice issue, but as an economic justice issue. It's that Michelle Alexander, I think, had an op-ed in the Times where she said economic justice is racial justice. There's no way around it. And she's 100% right about that and a lot of other things. And just to close, the criminal justice system, according to a report that was just released this week by the Center for Community Alternatives, the justice system in New York costs $18.2 billion. it would be shocking if something that big a part of the state economy had no collateral consequences for the broader state economy. It can't be the case that criminal justice, mass incarceration, is this isolated issue that has no effect on the economy. There's a really important interplay there that we need to address. And I think that's one really important reason to move forward in criminal justice reform, not just in any given year, but especially during a year like this.
Thank you so much, Ames. You know, all the data that you provided, and I mean, that we've heard throughout the conversation, allows us to understand that these systems of the collateral systems and, you know, the carceral state is not where it's at, you know, for lack of a better term. We know it's not working. We know that it's over costing not only the government and the state, but the people. Right. We know that it's, you know, it's not effective. We know that it is a driver and exacerbates poverty. And, you know, our mission at Leagues of Hope is ending poverty and incarceration of women and girls, because we understand you cannot do one without the other. And so, you know, you in the end just aligned that we have to think about the, you know, how we providing equity in communities that typically don't have it. And we're thinking about divestment and reinvestment. You know, that's how we start there. And, you know, this conversation has been just, you know, so much depth and breadth. And I've learned so much talking to everyone. But I do have one group question before I want to get to Q&A. So anyone or all of you could answer. And I wanted to open this up. We have several policymakers and legislators, as I stated, in attendance on this call. What would you recommend that legislators prioritize this year with parole reform? And how do we create system-wide change?
Topeka, if I can start, there's a bill that's being carried in the Senate by Senator Myrie, in the Assembly by Latrice Walker. It's a look-back bill, and what it does is it allows us to have cases where people have been given lengthy sentences, an opportunity to go back before the court and get resentenced. I support it. My office helped write that legislation. We are talking about parole, but I think it's important for us to also say there are a number of people in jail who will never see a parole board because they've been given a flat, determinate sentence. Was reviewing a case recently where a man who was 18 years old committed a terrible robbery and shot at the police, turned down a generous plea offer, and that plea offer was in the range of about 10 years, and after trial received 126 and a half years at 18 years of age. And when I learned about this case, this man has been in prison for nearly 38 years. And you know, roughly he's almost 90 years incarceration, and having the ability to go back and have a resentencing, looking at, you know, what he's accomplished and all the things that we believe in redemption, rehabilitation, and quite frankly, mercy, and also modern day values of what's fair and right. And so I encourage all of our legislators there and anyone who's listening to this to take a look at these bills. This is, you know, we talk about parole, but there's a lot of people in prison who will never see a parole board, and we have to have some, you know, ability to work with them. These should not be death sentences. They weren't sentenced to death, and quite frankly, that's where we're at. So please take a look at it, support it. I know that NYUJ is a supporter of this, and there should be some mobilization around helping people who can never get out of jail, even though everyone thinks they're ready to return home safely to the community. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Does anyone else want to tackle the question?
Yeah, I'll throw out one other idea as well. Actually, two. Another report that one of my colleagues produced for the Brennan Center found that prison sentences are simply too long. Like, I think a lot of people here are going to agree with that, but there's just an assumption that prison sentences are what they are. But actually, unnecessarily long prison sentences and parole reform, those go hand in hand, as the DA just spoke about. So I think we should be considering broad sentencing reform. In our report, we recommended an across-the-board reduction of around 25% of prison sentences nationwide. concluding that there are around more than 30% of people nationwide who are incarcerated without a public safety justification, and that a reform along those lines would help a lot of them. So I think we should definitely talk about sentencing reform as a complement to parole reform and helping people become parole eligible faster and provide a presumption of release. Tools like that are sort of means or vehicles to the same end, but these can all complement each other. Second, we talked about barriers to reentry, and that's a really important, also related issue. We've been thinking a lot about the effects of sealing and expungement. There's some good research that shows that letting people seal and expunge old records helps blunt the effect that prison and conviction have on wages that we identify in our research. So reforms like that, I think, should be very seriously considered as sort of things that should go hand in hand with parole. I don't want to get us too far afield from parole, but everything truly is connected here. So I think it's important to cast a wide net.
I would agree, if I can just sort of jump in, and thanks, Ames, and to you, Eric. I do think we have to sort of think about this sort of as what are all of the laws that create sort of the carceral state, and those include things like, not right now. We have a lawsuit right now where our Prisoners' Rights Project is suing the state because they're holding people who have mental illness in because their release plans are not sufficient, or they're releasing to the shelter system. And what do we know? That's just going to actually create a moment where there might be a failure, right? We have to look at that. We have to look at actually treatment as an alternative to jail, particularly for people who are struggling with mental health issues. And so there's growing sort of to sentencing and actual, incarceration. There are reforms right now that we can do, again, that sort of take us away from having to deal with somebody on parole because we have brought the service to them sooner, before ripping them away from community and family, right? And providing the services needed. So it has to be not siloed. It has to be a holistic approach. But certainly the parole reforms that are ready to go right now, less is more, fair and timely parole, the elder parole, and we have to talk about halting solitary confinement. Those things ready to go right now. And I'm hoping that we can get there.
Topeka, there was a question in the chat that an attorney, Cheryl Cates, asked about a plea bargain sort of being canceled because district attorneys oppose parole, instinctively. One of the things that I've been doing in Brooklyn is changing sort of the default positions of our office in order to change the mindset of how we hold people accountable. And so for us in the past, it was routine to ask for the maximum period of post-release supervision. We've changed that here in Brooklyn, where the assistant district attorney is supposed to ask for the minimum unless there's a reason to ask for the maximum. If they're going to ask for the maximum, they're supposed to get supervisory approval. But I think that shortens the period that we're looking at, post-release supervision. But one of the things that I did shortly after getting elected was I wrote a letter to the commissioner of docs at the time and said, there are thousands of parole letters that have been written on behalf of the district attorney's office from Kings County automatically opposing parole. That is no longer the position of our office, and we asked very clearly that parole notify us when someone is up for parole, and that we would give them a timely recommendation, whether we support parole, we take no position, or we're oppositional to parole. Because these letters, quite frankly, are often written right after a trial. In full disclosure, sometimes they're not even written by the attorney who handled the case. They might be written by a paralegal or a legal intern. And they're put into the file and they're sent to docs, and then they're read in someone's parole hearing 10 years later with no sort of approach to looking at who the person is before the parole board today, just simply the underlying nature of that charge. I thought that was wrongheaded. We've been, I'm very open that those old parole letters, unless there's a recent letter by me, no longer is the position of the office. And so I think that's a problem. And I do believe that when we negotiate with a person about what a fair plea bargain is, we should not then turn around and say, after they've completed the minimum term that they've negotiated, we're still asking the parole board to keep them in unless there's a compelling reason to do so. So thank you for the question. And just know that, I am actively telling my fellow district attorneys that we need to change our practices as it relates to the parole board as well in these letters that are being sent, often a decade before someone actually sees a parole board.
Thank you so much, DA Gonzalez, and that is so important. And I'm happy to hear that the position has changed on that. And so I think we have time for one more question, and it's from Terrell Hall, which I mentioned earlier around, he had done, federal probation, and then moved into, did 16 years in the state prison system in New York, and now has life parole. And so he's asking, how can we ensure that the processes that are set in place can be effective? If actually implemented, are we sure, how are they being enforced and supported by parole officers? That's a really great question. Where is the oversight going to come in, and how are we then holding the parole officers accountable if they're actually not doing the things that are implemented? So again, anyone, please take that question.
That is a really great question. And we see it often in our parole revocation defense unit. We'll often see that there are parole officers that want to go come to this job to actually help with reentry. And then there are those, such as the one that Amy described, that have sort of a very different motivation to come, and it's usually to perpetrate harm. I think that we have to require, as part of reforms, we have to require an accountable and transparent sort of, whether it's data or whether it's hearings where we are holding docs, where we're holding the systems accountable and to the public and to the families and to communities that have been long ignored. And I think that we have to require accountability. So when things go wrong, someone is held accountable. If somebody is motivated to come to that job to bring harm, but not the humanity that's really required as a parole officer, then they should not hold that job because it has to shift the culture. And look, we do hear that some officers don't want to violate people on technical violations. One of the things that we started to do is to make sure that we have advocates, paralegal case handlers that are connecting to people sooner when they come into community, to say, if you're nervous about making that parole meeting because you had a late curfew, reach out to us. We can be advocates. And I think sort of having mentors and advocates in communities centered around helping as opposed to harming, goes a long way. That goes along with these reforms.
Thank you so much, Tina. And Ames, I know that you had a final thought before we ended the panel. We have about 4 minutes left.
Yes, I saw someone in the Q&A asked about what reforms other states have done, because there have been a few references to how other states have reformed their parole systems. So I will be as quick as possible. There are 24 states that I know of that have adopted some sort of reform, either limiting or eliminating reincarceration for parole offenses. A recent example that comes to mind and that we've talked about before is South Carolina. After they passed reform that limited reincarceration, they saw a sharp drop in the number of revocations, sharp drop in the prison population. So these are reforms that can work and that have worked in other states too. The reforms I'm talking about are probably closest in nature to the Less is More Act, which DA Gonzalez brought up at the top and which I know we've been talking about throughout, which would limit the ability or limit the circumstances in which people are reincarcerated for technical violations or during the adjudication of a violation as well. So I think that's a really important bill with a lot of precedent from other states as well. So thank you for asking that.
for sure. And so I guess we're at time. So this is great. Although I'm sad that we have to go because there's so much more that I'm ready to learn, but also to have you all share for everyone to hear. But we can't. So I want to thank all of our panelists and all those who attended today's roundtable for joining. This has been a critical conversation on how we're going to change, and I'm speaking that, New York State's parole system. If you'd like to learn more information, please visit nyuj.org for more information and resources on parole reform. Please have a blessed, great, and safe day. Thank you.
Thank you, Topeka.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was great. It was good. So great. Thank you all.